The night I walked out of that restaurant, I already knew enough. Enough words, enough calculation, enough of the plan they thought was safely buried inside a language I was never supposed to understand. My name is Odalys Braswell. I am 62 years old. I spent 28 years as a DOJ-contracted federal court interpreter. French was my primary working language for 19 of those years. I sat 3 feet from defendants, witnesses, and attorneys in federal proceedings and translated every word with surgical precision. I know what deception sounds like in 2 languages. That night at dinner, I heard it in 1. My stepdaughter Lachelle had been seeing Lucien Marchand for 6 months. When she told me his parents were flying in from France specifically to meet us, I pressed my good dress and told myself to be open. Lachelle deserved that. She had been through enough loss for one life, and the way she talked about Lucien, the way her whole face changed, I wanted it to be real for her. I genuinely did. The restaurant was upscale Jacksonville, white tablecloths, soft lighting, the kind of place where people perform their best selves. Lucien arrived first with Lachelle, and I will say this, the man is polished, warm handshake, easy smile. He looked at Lachelle the way a man looks at something he chose carefully. I noticed that. I filed it. Armand and Sylviane Marchand arrived 7 minutes later. Armand was tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed. Sylviane was the kind of elegant that takes decades to construct. They embraced Lachelle like they had always known her. The table felt warm, easy. I let myself breathe. If you are watching this late at night and something already feels wrong to you, you are paying attention. Drop the time in the comments. I want to know who is up with me. Within 20 minutes, Sylviane began speaking to Armand in French. Softly at first. The way people do when they assume the conversation belongs only to them. I kept my face neutral. I reached for my water glass. I listened. She said Lachelle was perfect, more trusting than they anticipated. She said things were moving smoothly, smoother than expected. She mentioned paperwork and timing. She said once the marriage was established, everything afterward would become simpler, cleaner. She made a quiet joke about how some women sign documents faster when they think love is already settled. Then Armand said something low enough that I almost missed it. 18 months is safer. Nodded once. No conflict, she said softly. No unnecessary attention. By then, she will sign whatever's placed in front of her. I set my fork down, not from shock. I set it down the way I set down a pen after finishing a legal transcript. Deliberately, completely, with the full understanding that what came next required both hands free. I folded my napkin. I stood. I did not look at Lachelle. I did not look at Lucien. I looked at the space above the table, at no one and everyone, and I said 5 words. This marriage will not hold. Then I turned and walked out. Behind me, the table went silent. Not the silence of confusion, not offense. I know those silences. This was the silence of calculation. Someone rapidly assessing what just changed and what it would cost. I did not need to see Armand's face to know it was his silence. I had heard enough in that courtroom career to recognize the sound of a man running numbers in his head. I pushed through the restaurant door into the warm Jacksonville night and kept walking. My car was 3 rows back. I got in, started the engine, pulled onto the street. That is when my phone lit up on the passenger seat. Lachelle's name. Once. Twice. A 3rd time. I watched it and drove. I did not go to bed that night. I drove home, changed out of my good dress, and went straight to Darnell's study. Not because I had a plan yet, because that was the only room in the house where I could think without feeling like the walls were closing in. Darnell had been gone 3 years. I had kept his study exactly as he left it. His desk, his filing cabinet, the worn leather chair that still held the shape of him. I told myself I kept it because I was not ready. That night, I understood I had kept it because I was going to need it. I opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. The folder was where it had always been: business correspondence, partial agreements, letters going back 11 years. I had looked through it once after the funeral, found nothing I could understand without a lawyer, and put it back. I had been grieving. I had trusted the wrong person to manage what I did not yet know how to read. I spread everything across the desk, and I read it differently this time. Not as a widow trying to understand paperwork. As a woman who had just heard a French conversation that told her exactly what kind of man Armand Marchand was. I pulled out a legal pad and did what my training built into me over 28 years. I wrote down every French sentence I had heard at that dinner table. word for word. The precision was not effort, it was reflex. I had transcribed federal testimony under pressure for nearly 3 decades. A dinner conversation in a quiet restaurant was nothing my memory could not hold. I made 2 columns, what I knew, what I needed to confirm. What I knew was enough to make my hands still on the desk. What I needed to confirm was going to take something more than a legal pad. I worked through the correspondence slowly. Most of it was what it appeared to be: 2 men building something together. The easy back and forth of a partnership that trusted itself. Darnell's handwriting in the margins. Small notes. Questions about shipments, market contacts, distribution timelines. His penmanship was careful and deliberate. The way he did everything. I had to stop twice. Not to cry, to breathe. There is a difference. Near the bottom of the folder, I found a letter I did not remember seeing before. It was from Armand, dated 2 weeks after Darnell's funeral. The others were warm. Even in business matters, Armand had always written the way he spoke, with that practiced European courtesy that made everything feel like friendship. This letter was different. The warmth was still there on the surface, but underneath it the language had shifted. Administrative, precise. It referenced what Armand called a mutual understanding going forward regarding the management and continuity of shared business interests. No specifics, no vague terms, just that phrase, mutual understanding. Sitting in the middle of a letter written to a dead man's widow who was too deep in grief to read the room. I read it twice, then I set it face down on the desk, not because I was finished with it, because I needed a moment before I let myself understand what it meant that this letter existed. That 2 weeks after I buried my husband, Armand Marchand had already put pen to paper. The study was quiet around me. Darnell's chair, Darnell's filing cabinet, Darnell's careful handwriting in the margins of documents that someone had been counting on me, never reading closely. I pulled the legal pad back toward me and picked up the pen. He knocked at 9:15 the next morning. I heard the knock and I knew before I opened the door. Slucia Marchand did not strike me as a man who let problems sit overnight without attempting to manage them. He was alone, no Armand, no Sylviane. Just him on my front step with a careful expression, concern wearing the costume of warmth. He was dressed simply, intentionally casual, the kind of casual that takes effort to construct. Mrs. Braswell, he smiled. I hope it's not too early, I wanted to come by. Last night, I think there was some tension, and I don't want that sitting between us. I stepped back from the door. Come in, I said. I was just making coffee. I did not apologize for the night before. I did not explain myself. I went to the kitchen and he followed, and I felt him reading the house the same way I had read Armand's letters, looking for information in the details. I poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and sat down across the table. He talked. I let him. He said Lachelle was upset, but she would come around. He said his parents were traditional, and the dinner had perhaps felt more formal than he intended. He said he hoped we could start fresh. That family mattered to him, that my relationship with Lachelle mattered to him, that he wanted to be someone I could trust. Every sentence was correctly constructed. The pauses were placed where pauses should go. The eye contact was steady without being aggressive. I had spent 28 years in federal courtrooms listening to people perform sincerity under pressure, and I recognized the architecture of it immediately. That did not mean I believed every pause was proof of guilt. I had been wrong about people before, but I had learned over the years that rehearsed warmth often revealed itself in the small adjustments. The moments when a conversation stopped moving the way someone expected. What I watched for was not what he said. It was the half-second recalibration when I did not respond the way he expected. When I nodded without warmth, he adjusted. When I asked a simple question about how he and Lachelle met, and let the silence sit a beat too long after his answer, something moved behind his eyes. Quick, almost imperceptible. And then the smile came back, slightly repositioned. He was good. I gave him that. I gave him nothing else. I was pleasant, unhurried. I asked about France. I asked about his work in a way that required no specific answer. I refilled his cup without being asked. I was the picture of a woman who had simply had an emotional moment at dinner and was now graciously moving past it. By the time he stood to leave, his posture had loosened. He believed he had accomplished what he came to do. I walked him to the door and said it was good of him to stop by. He said, of course, family first, and smiled the smile he had been wearing the whole visit, warm, practiced, generous. I closed the door and went straight to the window, His car was still in the driveway. He had not started the engine. He sat completely still, not checking his mirrors, not on his phone. Just sitting with both hands in his lap, staring through the windshield at nothing. That stillness. I had seen it before, across a restaurant table, on a different marchand. Maybe I was reaching too much into it. Maybe he was simply collecting himself before driving away. But something about the quiet calculation of it settled wrong in my chest. Then his phone lit up. He glanced at the screen, and something in his whole body changed. The set of his shoulders, the angle of his jaw. He answered and smiled. But it was not the smile he had worn in my kitchen. This one was looser, unbothered. The smile of a man who had just stepped out of a role he had been playing and back into himself. I could not see the screen from the window. But the timing, the expression, the ease that settled into him, I suspected the call was Lachelle. She did not knock. She had a key, and she used it, and the sound of my front door opening that afternoon told me everything about what kind of conversation was coming. Lachelle walked into the living room, and she was not the glowing woman I had watched across a restaurant table the night before. She was hurt. The kind of hurt that has had hours to harden into something sharper. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at me. "You humiliated me." I did not respond immediately. I set down what I was holding and gave her my full attention. She deserved that much. His parents flew from France, Mama. They crossed an ocean to sit at a table with us, and you walked out. You just left, in front of everyone. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed past it. "Do you know what Lucien had to say to them after you left? Do you know how I felt sitting there?" I kept my face steady, not cold, steady. "You have never trusted anyone I loved, not once. Every time I find something good, you find a reason to pull back from it, and this time I am not going to let you do it." She stopped, swallowed. "Lucien is a good man. His family came here in good faith, and you insulted all of them." She was not wrong about how it looked. I understood that completely. From where she was testing, she had watched her stepmother stand up at a family dinner and deliver a verdict without explanation. She had every right to be angry. What she did not have was the information that made my silence the only sane. If I told her what I heard, right now in this room, with nothing but a legal pad of notes and a folder of old correspondence, Lucien would know within the hour. He would call it grief, paranoia. A lonely widow projecting darkness onto the first happiness her stepdaughter had found. And Lachelle, standing here with that crack in her voice, would want to believe him. Not because she was foolish, because she was in love, and love looks for reasons to hold on. Any accusation I made today would hand him exactly the window he needed to accelerate everything. So I absorbed it, every word. I let her finish completely before I spoke. "I hear you," I said, "and I am not going to argue with how it looked." I paused. "I am asking you for one thing. Just slow the engagement down a little. Nothing dramatic. Just give it some time before anything is announced. Give me a little time." She stared at me. "Time for what?" "Just time." Her jaw tightened. "No." She picked up her bag from the chair. "I am done waiting for you to be comfortable with my life." She moved toward the door and stopped with her hand on the frame. "I love you, but I am not doing this." The door closed behind her, not a slam. That almost made it worse. I sat with the quiet for a long time. Silence is not weakness. I had to keep reminding myself of that. Silence right now was the only move that kept the outcome intact. Anything else, and I lost her before I could protect her. That evening, I was in Darnell's study when my phone screen lit up with a notification. Lachelle had posted on social media an engagement announcement. A photograph of her and Lucien, her face radiant, his arm around her shoulders. The Marchands had already commented, all three of them, warmly, immediately, as if they had been waiting with their fingers ready. 3 days. No calls to Lachelle. No contact with the Marchands. Just Darnell's study, his filing cabinet, and every document he left behind spread across that desk in the order I needed them. I had been an executor of his estate since the week after he died. His Turk had walked me through the role at the time. What it meant, what it required, what authority it carried. I had nodded through most of it, while grief sat on my chest like something physical. I had signed what needed signing, and trusted that the important things were handled. I understood now that trusting things were handled was exactly what someone had been counting on. I pulled everything, business filings going back 11 years, bank correspondence, partial agreements. records of an import-export operation with reach into both the U.S. market and southern France. Darnell's name was on all of it alongside Armand Marchand's, 50% each. Built over a decade of what looked, from the paper trail, like genuine partnership. The business was real, profitable, established, and Darnell's half of it had never been formally distributed from his estate. I called my attorney that same afternoon, not to move yet, to understand what I was standing on before I put any weight on it. He confirmed what I needed to hear. As executor, I had full legal standing to act on any matter involving estate assets. That included a business interest sitting unresolved in probate. The standing was not ambiguous. It was clean. Then he told me something that stopped me completely. Someone had filed a motion several months earlier to have Darnell's estate declared administratively closed due to inactivity. If the motion succeeded, recovering unresolved assets later could become significantly more difficult, especially a business interest that had been sitting untouched for years. I sat with that for a moment. Lachelle had met Lucien sometime around that same stretch of months. Not exact, but close enough that I felt something cold move through me anyway. I told my attorney I would call him back, and I returned to the desk. I went through the older correspondence more carefully this time. Letters from Armand across the full 11 years. Updates, proposals, the comfortable shorthand of two men who had worked alongside each other long enough to stop explaining themselves. Darnell's margin notes throughout. His handwriting precise and unhurried, the way he approached everything he cared about. Near the bottom of a stack from 4 years back, I found a letter from Armand that referenced something in passing. A family update, brief, the kind of line a man adds to a business letter to keep it warm. He mentioned that Lucien had recently married. He gave the wife's name, Isabeau. Darnell had circled it in pencil, lightly, the kind of circle a person makes when something catches their attention, without yet knowing why. There was no note beside it, no question, just the circle, thin graphite around a single name. I stared at it for a long time. I did not know yet what it meant that Lucien Marchand had a wife named Isabeau. I did not know what Darnell had thought when he circled it. I did not know why the name felt like it mattered, but it had mattered enough for Darnell to mark it. And Darnell did not mark things without reason. I set the letter carefully to the side. Then I picked up the phone and called my attorney back. He answered on the second ring. I said 3 words. Stop that filing. Lachelle called me on a Tuesday morning, and I could hear it in her voice before she said a word. That particular brightness that comes when someone believes they have just been proven right. Sylviane called me, she said. She wants to plan an engagement party. Within the month. She said it is a European tradition. That the family celebrates properly before they return home. A pause. She was so warm, Mama, she didn't have to do that. I kept my voice even. What did you tell her? I told her yes. Another pause, this one pointed. Lucien also called. He said Armand's health has been uncertain lately. That it would mean everything to his father to see them properly celebrated while he's still feeling well enough to enjoy it. I said nothing. I just thought you should know, Lachelle said. The warmth in her voice had a quiet edge to it. She was not calling to inform me. She was calling to show me that the people I had insulted at dinner had responded with grace and she wanted me to feel the difference. I hear you, I said. Thank you for telling me. After she hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand, and I understood exactly what had just happened. Not the engagement party, not Sylviane's warmth or Lucien's story about his father's health. What I understood was the mechanism underneath all of it. Armand Marchand was not a man who accelerated without reason. He had built an 11-year business partnership on patience. He had waited 3 years after Darnell died before making his move. Patience was his natural operating mode. Something had disrupted that. 5 words across a restaurant table. He did not know what I knew. He could not be certain I had understood the French. But he was a careful man, and careful men do not ignore variables they cannot quantify. I had stood up and said something that could have meant anything, and that ambiguity was more dangerous to him than a direct accusation would have been. A direct accusation he could counter, uncertainty he could not control. So he was compressing the timeline, get the engagement locked publicly, build momentum that would be socially and emotionally difficult to reverse. Move the paperwork forward before whatever I suspected hardened into something actionable. Lucien's story about Armand's health was a tool, Nothing more. A way to wrap urgency in emotion, so Lachelle would push the timeline herself without needing to be asked twice. I noted it. A man who was genuinely unwell does not send his son to manage a dinner the morning after a family conflict. Armand Marchandy was not sick, he was strategic. What neither of them knew was that I had already moved. The estate filing was blocked. My standing as executor was confirmed. And in 3 years of trusting the wrong people with Darnell's affairs, I had learned one thing clearly: I would not be slow again. Speed creates mistakes. I had seen it in federal proceedings more times than I could count. Pressure compresses judgment. When careful people are forced to move fast, they leave things behind. I intended to be there when something fell. I picked up the phone and called my attorney. He answered on the first ring. "The filing is handled," he said. "I know," I said. "I need something else now, the business. I need the full valuation. Every number. Everything." A brief pause on his end. "I'll get started today," he said. My attorney's office was quiet that morning. He had the documents spread across the conference table before I arrived. Organized, flagged, the way a man presents information he knows is going to land hard. I sat down and let him walk me through it. The business had been operating for 11 years. Import-export. American goods moving into southern French markets, European specialty goods coming back the other direction. Established supplier relationships on both sides, a client base that had taken years to build. The kind of operation that does not happen by accident. 2 men had built it carefully, and it had grown steadily because they were both good at what they did. Darnell's 50% share based on current valuation was substantial. My attorney gave me the number, and I sat with it for a moment without speaking. It was enough to permanently change Lachelle's financial life. Enough to fund whatever she wanted to build. Enough to matter enormously to anyone who needed it to disappear quietly. Since Darnell's death, Armand had been drawing full operational income, not his half, all of it. Managing the business as though sole ownership had transferred to him automatically, which it had not, could not, and never would without documentation that did not exist. I asked about the partnership structure. My attorney confirmed what the files had already suggested. The agreement between Darnell and Armand was never fully executed. No buy-sell provision, no succession clause, what that meant legally cut in both directions. Armand could not easily prove sole ownership. But it also meant Lachelle's inherited interest had been sitting unprotected in open water for 3 years, while Armand collected everything it produced. What he needed was her signature releasing that interest. One document. Properly worded, properly pressured, signed by a trusting woman who did not know what she was holding. I pulled out the letter, the one dated 2 weeks after Darnell's funeral. I slid it across the table. My attorney read it without rushing. Then he looked up. This is him positioning himself as informal manager of the estate's business interest, he said. It carries no legal weight. It was never filed with the court. It was never countersigned by anyone with standing to agree to it. He set it down. This is a piece of paper Armand Marchand wrote to himself. 2 weeks after my husband's funeral. While I was choosing what to put on the table at the repast, Armand had been at a desk somewhere composing the first document in a plan he had already begun building. I thanked my attorney and drove home. That evening, I went back to the filing cabinet. I had been through most of it by now, but there was a section in the back I had not fully cleared. Older materials, photographs, things Darnell had kept for reasons that were his own. I found the photograph near the bottom. Darnell and Armand at a business dinner, both of them laughing. The full, unguarded laugh of men who are genuinely comfortable with each other. Armand had his arm around Darnell's shoulders. Darnell was looking at something off camera, his face completely open. He had no idea. That was what the photograph showed me that the documents could not. Darnell had trusted this man completely, not cautiously, not professionally. The way you trust someone you have eaten with, traveled with, built something real alongside for over a decade. He had no idea what kind of man was standing next to him. I held the photograph for a long time. Then I turned it face down on the desk. My attorney called as I was sitting there. I answered. There's one more thing, he said. Armand's financial activity since Darnell's death, the income he's been drawing, the transactions. Some of it moved across state lines, repeatedly. He let that sit for a moment. The pattern raises questions beyond a simple accounting dispute, he said carefully. Depending on the representations made and how the money was moved, it could interest the wrong kind of investigators. I want to review that part more thoroughly before I say anything stronger. I called Lucien on a Wednesday morning and kept it simple. I told him I had been thinking and that I owed him a proper conversation. That I was not good at apologies, but I was trying. Would he come for coffee? He said yes without hesitating. That told me something too. He arrived at 11. Same careful casualness as before. The clothing, the expression, the measured warmth. He had prepared for this visit. I had been counting on that. Prepared people follow their preparation. They stop listening as closely as they should. I made coffee, and we sat, and I let him set the early tone. He was gracious about it. Magnanimous, even. He said he understood that grief changes people, and that he held no resentment. I nodded and thanked him, and then I started asking questions the way I had learned to ask them in 28 years of federal work. Sideways, embedded inside other sentences, dressed as curiosity rather than examination. The first confirmation came 12 minutes in. I mentioned Darnell warmly. Said I had been going through some of his old business papers. Just organizing, I said. The way you do when grief finally lets you move. And that it was good to be reminded of what he had built. I described the import-export structure in general terms and watched Lucien's face. He nodded. Specific. Comfortable. He said it sounded like a well-established operation and used a word, distribution reach, that does not come naturally to a man who learned about a business from his girlfriend's passing references. He caught himself a half-beat too late and smoothed it with a smile. I smiled back and moved on. The second confirmation came when I mentioned that the engagement felt like it was moving quickly and that I only raised it because I wanted to understand. Not object, just understand. A man in love with my daughter would have talked about her, about how certain he felt, about not wanting to wait. Lucien talked about timing, about how these things were easier to manage when the foundational paperwork was in order early. He used the word paperwork twice. The second time he heard himself and pivoted to something warmer, but the pivot was a fraction too smooth. I nodded again and refilled his cup. The third confirmation was the one that mattered most. I mentioned casually that I really needed to sit down properly with Darnell's estate attorney soon, that I had been putting it off, and things had a way of slipping through when you were not paying attention. Lucien went still, not long, less than 2 seconds. But I had spent nearly 3 decades measuring the pauses between words in high-pressure rooms, and I knew exactly what that particular stillness meant. He knew about the estate, the filing, the motion that was now blocked. He knew, and the mention of it had touched something he was working to keep covered. He recovered cleanly, said it was probably wise to get those things sorted, said he was sure Darnell had left things in good order. I agreed and walked him to the door. When I returned to the window, he was already on his phone, not sitting still the way he had the first visit, deciding, composing himself. This was different. He was talking before he had fully settled into the seat. His free hand was moving. His head was angled forward. This was not a man deciding what to report. This was a man reporting something that could not wait. I noted the time. Then I went back to the desk. My attorney called Thursday morning, and I sat down before he finished his first sentence. The picture was complete. Lashley Braswell was the legal heir to 50% of a business her father had spent 11 years building. It had never been formally distributed from his estate. It had never been signed away. It had never been forfeited. It had simply sat, unresolved, unprotected, generating income that Armand Marchand had been collecting in full since the week Darnell's obituary ran in the paper. My attorney walked me through the numbers carefully. The valuation, the income drawn, the paper trail of a man who had operated with complete confidence that no one who mattered was paying attention. He had been right about that. For 3 years he had been exactly right. I had been the executor of Darnell's estate since the week after he died. I had signed the paperwork. I had accepted the responsibility. And then, grief had sat on me like a stone, and Armand had arrived at the repast with food and condolences, and that warm European courtesy, and I had trusted him the way Darnell had trusted him. Completely, without architecture, because it had never occurred to either of us that the friendship was a position he had always been willing to abandon when the numbers were right. I did not perform guilt about that. Guilt was a weight I could not afford right now. What I did instead was correct. I thanked my attorney and told him to prepare a formal summary. Every number, every finding, clean enough that anyone reading it would understand exactly what had been taken and from whom. Then I sat at Darnell's desk and I built the package, business filings, the blocked estate motion, the attorney's formal summary, the verbatim transcript of every French sentence I had heard at that restaurant, typed cleanly, my DOJ federal interpreter credentials attached to the front page as context for my professional fluency and transcript methodology. I had prepared transcripts like this in federal proceedings for 19 years. This one carried weight. I stacked everything in order and sat looking at it. The conversation ahead was the most important one I had ever prepared for. Not because I did not know what to say. I knew exactly what the documents said and what they meant. The preparation was about something more specific than content. It was about delivery. If I called Lachelle, she would hear my voice, and she would feel the weight of it before I said O's word, and she would call Lucienne. I knew my daughter. When she was frightened, she reached for the thing she believed was keeping her safe. Right now, that thing was him. A phone call gave her 30 seconds to reach for her other phone before I had said anything she could hold on to. The documentation was physical. It had to be placed in front of her where she could touch it, read it, sit with it, before her hands reached for anything else. I could not do that through a phone call. I picked up my phone anyway, old reflex. The instinct to prepare someone before you arrive. I held it for a moment. Then I set it face down on the desk. I gathered the package, picked up my keys, walked through the house to the front door, and pulled it open, and stood for a moment in the warm Jacksonville air. Lachelle lived 14 minutes away. I got in the car. Lachelle answered to the door, close, her hair pulled back, a Sunday ease about her that told me she had not been expecting anyone. When she saw me, her expression shifted, not quite closed, not quite open, somewhere cautious in between. Mama, not a greeting, a question. I need to sit with you, I said. Please. She stepped back and let me in. Her apartment was tidy, warm. There were flowers on the kitchen counter, the kind a man sends when he wants to be thought of in the spaces he does not yet occupy. I noted them and said nothing. I moved to the small dining table and set the package down and sat. Lachelle stayed standing, her arms crossed loosely, not defensive yet, just uncertain. She was reading the package on the table without touching it. What is that? She said. Sit down, baby. Something in my voice reached her. She sat. I did not ease into it. I had decided on the drive over that easing in was a kindness that would cost too much. So I told her, directly, from the beginning. I told her what I had heard at that dinner table in French. Every sentence Sylviane had spoken to Armand while Lachelle sat glowing 3 feet away. I told her what the words meant. The timeline, the paperwork, the 18 months, the divorce that had already been planned before the engagement was even announced. Lachelle's jaw tightened. That is not, let me finish. She closed her mouth. I told her about her father's business, what he had built, what it was worth, what Armand had been collecting since the week Darnell was buried. I told her about the estate filing, the motion to close it, initiated 3 months ago, right when Lucien introduced himself to her. I told her what her signature on a marriage document would have allowed Lucien to place in front of her, and what she would have been releasing without knowing she held it. She was shaking her head slowly before I finished. You have never wanted this for me. This is about you not being able to. Your father built this for you. I kept my voice at level. I am not asking you to believe me. I am asking you to read what he signed. I slid the first document toward her and waited. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when something irreversible is about to happen. Lachelle looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked down at the document. Her hands came off her lap and she pulled it closer, slowly, like she was not fully deciding to, like her hands had made a choice her mouth had not agreed to yet. I watched her raid. I watched the resistance first. The tight set of her shoulders, the way she held herself slightly away from the page, as though proximity meant agreement. Then the slowing, her eyes moving more carefully, stopping, going back. Then something changed in her face, not collapse, not tears. Something quieter and more permanent than either of those. The specific shift of a person whose understanding of something has just been rebuilt from the ground up and will never reassemble the way it was before. I did not name what I saw. I did not reach for her hand. I just sat with her in it and let it be what it was. That was when her phone lit up on the table between us. Lucien's name on the screen. Lachelle looked at it. I looked at it. Neither of us spoke. Lachelle looked at the phone for 3 full seconds before she picked it up. She answered without putting it on speaker. I did not move. I sat across the table with my hands folded, and I watched her face the way I had watched witnesses in federal proceedings, reading what the body said when the mouth was trying to say something else. Lucien's voice was warm. I could hear the tone of it from where I sat, not the words, just the register. Easy, unhurried. The sound of a man who did not yet know what was sitting on the table. Lachelle looked down at the documents in her lap, then she asked him, quietly, no accusation in it. Just woman's, asking a simple question to a man she was supposed to marry. Did your father and my father have a business together? The pause was brief. Maybe 4 seconds. But I had spent decades in rooms where 4 seconds of silence after a direct question told you everything the answer was going to try to hide. He recovered. I could hear the shift in his tone even from across the table. Warmer suddenly, more careful. He said something. Lachelle's expression did not change. She said, "You're saying you don't know anything about it." He said more. She listened. Her eyes moved to the window and stayed there. The particular stillness of a person who is listening not to be persuaded, but to confirm something they have already understood. Then he said Odalis' name. I could hear it clearly. And the sentence around it, the framing of it, had the shape of a man redirecting. Lachelle's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She looked at me while he spoke, not for reassurance, not with accusation. She looked at me the way you look at someone when you decide whether the thing in front of you is real, and you already know the answer, but you are taking one last moment before you let it change everything. I held her gaze and said nothing. She looked back at the table, at the document with Darnell's name on it, at the letter where Armand had referenced a name in passing, and Darnell had circled it in pencil and said nothing beside it. She said the name, Isabeau. The silence on the other end of that phone was a different kind of silence than the first. Longer, heavier, the silence of a man who has just heard something he was not prepared to hear and is calculating how far it reaches. When he spoke again, his voice was calmer than before, controlled. He said she was misunderstanding fragments of information that had nothing to do with them. Lachelle closed her eyes for 1 second, just one. Then she opened them. Okay, she said, quietly. Okay, she ended the call. She did not throw the phone. She did not raise her voice. She set the phone face down on top of the documents, on top of her father's name, on top of the circled pencil mark, on top of everything, and she looked at her hands in her lap. The apartment was very quiet. I did not reach for her. I did not speak. Some moments require a witness, not a hand. I sat with her in it and let it be exactly as large as it was. We stayed like that for a while. Then my phone rang. I did not recognize the number immediately. I answered. The voice was warm, measured, impeccably pleasant. Mrs. Braswell. A slight pause. This is Armand. I think we should meet. I did not call Armand back that night. I let him wait the way he had let Darnell's estate wait, with patience and the quiet confidence of someone who understood that time was a tool and right now it belonged to me. What I did instead was call Raymond Ossie. We had worked parallel federal assignments for 11 years. He as a litigation support specialist, me as the interpreter in the same proceedings. When he left DOJ, he moved into international legal services. If anyone could locate a woman in France without alerting the family connected to her, it was Raymond. I told him only what he needed to know. A name, a country, a family. 3 days later, he called me back with a phone number and a time zone. I waited until early evening Jacksonville time, late night in France, and I dialed. She answered on the 4th ring. Oui, careful, already guarded. I spoke in English deliberately. I wanted her to choose the language, to feel the small control of that choice. My name is Odalis Brass, I said. I am calling from Jacksonville, Florida. I am not connected to the Marchand family. I need 5 minutes. A pause. People who say they are not connected to that family are often the most connected. I understand that, I said. I would feel the same way. Silence. I did not push into it. I did not fill it with reassurance or urgency. I had learned in federal work that the worst thing you can do with a reluctant witness is crowd them. So I waited. Then she said, "What do you want?" "I have a young woman here who was chosen for her signature," I said. "Her father built something real and spent 11 years building it. I want to make sure she keeps what he left her." The silence this time was longer, different in quality from the first. Not suspicious, something else. Something working through itself. When Isabeau spoke again, her voice had shifted. Not warm, but open in the specific way of a person who has been holding something alone for too long and has just been handed a reason to put it down. She knew about Lachelle. She had known for months. She had been told the American arrangement was temporary. Armand's word, delivered directly, with the certainty of a man who did not expect to be questioned. She had been told Lucien would handle the matter and come home, and that would be the end of it. She had spent months understanding that none of that was true. The plan was longer than she had been told. More deliberate. Lucien was not coming home on the timeline she had been promised because the timeline had never been what Armand described to her. She had been managed the same way Lachelle had been managed, with careful information, selectively delivered, designed to keep her cooperative and quiet. She confirmed the marriage, the date, the location in France. She confirmed the plan as Armand had explained it to her. She confirmed that every direction had come from him. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" "A written statement," I said. "Formal signed. Everything you just told me." A long pause. "I will need a few days," she said carefully. "I want it written correctly." "Take the time you need," I said. After the call, I sat in the quiet of her for a long time. Two women. One man's damage running through both their lives like a crack in a foundation. Present from the beginning. Invisible until the weight became too much. I picked up my phone and called Armand. He answered on the second ring. "I have been hoping to hear from you," he said. "Let's meet," I said. Isabeau's statement arrived early the following week. I printed it, and added it to the stack without comment. It said everything it needed to say in the precise, careful language of a woman who had decided that if she was going to speak, she was going to be believed. Dates, conversations, Armand's exact instructions as she had received them, the timeline she had been given, and the ways it had been quietly revised without her knowledge. It was thorough, it was damning, and it was signed. I spent the next 2 days at my attorney's office. We organized everything in sequence. The way evidence is organized when it is meant to tell a story that cannot be interrupted or reframed. The partnership records establishing Darnell's 50% interest. The documentation of Armand's unilateral financial activity since Darnell's death, every transaction, every income draw, the pattern of a man treating shared property as his own across multiple states and over 3 years. The estate filing motion, its initiation date, and the timeline connecting it to Lucien's first contact with Lachelle. Isabeau's signed statement. The verbatim dinner transcript with my DOJ federal interpreter credentials attached as context for my professional fluency and transcript methodology. I had submitted work product in federal proceedings for 19 years. I knew what held and what didn't. This held. My attorney flagged one additional point while we were reviewing the financial records. Lucien Marchand was still legally married to Isabeau in France. Any attempt to formalize a legal marriage to Lachelle, while that marriage remained active, would have exposed it to significant legal scrutiny and immediately complicated the enforceability of any marital or financial agreements connected to the estate interest. The structure of the plan became clearer after that. The engagement itself had value long before an actual legal marriage certificate ever existed. Public commitment, emotional trust, shared financial paperwork signed under the assumption that a legitimate marriage was approaching. A woman in love does not always stop to ask why a document is arriving early, if she believes a wedding is already inevitable. That was the opening they had been building toward. The signature. The release of interest. The quiet transfer of what Darnell built. They had been counting on no one looking closely enough before the pressure and momentum carried everything forward. I sat with that for a moment, not with satisfaction, with the particular steadiness of a woman who has confirmed that the ground she is standing on is solid, and the ground the other side is standing on is not. I did not over-prepare emotionally for the meeting. Emotion in a room like the one we were walking into was a liability, something the other side could grab and redirect. I had watched it happen in proceedings too many times to make that mistake. What I brought to that table would be precision, sequence, and 28 years of knowing exactly how to present material that does not need embellishment. I prepared Lachelle the same way. I told her what would be on the table and what each item meant. I told her the Marchans would likely open with something that sounded reasonable, a settlement frame, a concession, the language of men who believe they can still negotiate their way to a partial win. I told her to let them finish. I told her to let the documents speak. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I just want to be in the room." "You will be," I said. "You have every right to be." The morning of the meeting, my phone rang at 7:40. "Lachelle, I want to be there," she said. "I know," I said. "Come." The conference room at my attorney's office had no windows facing the street. 4 walls, a long table, overhead lighting that made everything look exactly like what it was. I had asked for that specifically. No view, no softness, nothing that gave the room a mood it had not earned. Armand arrived first. He walked in the way he did everything. Unhurried, composed, the kind of man who has never needed to rush because rooms have always arranged themselves around him. He wore a dark jacket, no tie. The studied casualness of someone who wanted to signal that this was a conversation between reasonable people, not a confrontation. He shook my attorney's hand. He nodded to me with something that resembled warmth. Lucien came in behind him and took the chair to his father's left without looking across the table. Sylviane sat to Armand's right, her posture precise, her expressions pleasant and closed. Lachelle sat beside me and said nothing. Armand opened. He was good at it. He acknowledged that there had been some confusion around the business structure following Darnell's passing. He said he had always intended to formalize things properly when the timing was right. He said he understood emotions were running high and that he respected that, and that in the spirit of honoring what Darnell had built, he was prepared to offer a settlement. Modest, clean, something that let everyone move forward without ugliness. He folded his hands on the table and looked at me with the expression of a man who has just been more than fair. I let him finish completely. Then I opened the folder. I placed the documents on the table one at a time the way I had placed transcripts before judges for 28 years. Without commentary, without expression, in the sequence that told the story most clearly. The partnership records first. Darnell's name, Armand's name, 50% each. 11 years of a business that had never legally changed hands. The financial records next. Every income draw Armand had made since Darnell's death, totaled, dated, crossing state lines in a pattern my attorney had documented thoroughly and characterized in writing as civil fraud with federal wire fraud exposure. The estate filing motion, initiation date circled, 3 months ago. The same month, Lucien introduced himself to Lachelle. Isabeau's signed statement. I placed it directly in front of Armand. He looked at it without touching it. Something moved through his face and was gone in under a second. The bigamy documentation last. Lucien's legal marriage in France. The date, the registration, the legal consequences, any subsequent marriage void from inception, every document signed within it unenforceable. I did not editorialize. I did not raise my voice. I presented. The room was completely quiet. Lucien was looking at the table, not at Lachelle, not at me. At the surface of the table in front of him, like a man waiting for something to be over. Sylviane's composure, which had held through every chapter of this, fractured, not dramatically. A tightening around the eyes, a stillness in her hands that was different from controlled. The stillness of someone who has just understood that the room they walked into was not the room they prepared for. Armand went very still. I recognized it. I had clocked it the first time across a restaurant table when I said 5 words and stood up. It was not confusion. It was never confusion. It was calculation, running the numbers, finding them gone. He knew. He had known since that dinner. He had simply believed he could outrun it. He could not. The Marchans gathered themselves to leave in silence. Chairs pushed back. Jackets straightened. That was when Lachelle spoke. She looked directly at Lucien. Her voice was even, quiet. "My father liked you," he told me once. A pause. "I thought you should know that." Lucien stopped. He had no answer. There was no answer to that sentence, and every person in that room understood why. Over the following months, the legal process moved the way precise documentation usually moves, slower than television, quieter than rumor, steadily enough that the other side never found a clean seam to pull. Lachelle's inherited 50% share was formally recognized through probate court proceedings after the estate records were fully reviewed. The administrative closure motion, filed months earlier against Darnell's estate, was challenged and ultimately struck from the record after the court determined the filing party had no standing to initiate it. My standing as executor was never the issue. It had simply been waiting for me to use it. The civil claim against Armand was filed through my attorney. 3 years of unilateral income, draws from a jointly held business interest, documented across multiple states, were organized and presented with the same sequence that sat on that conference room table. Questions surrounding the financial activity were separately referred for additional review by the appropriate authorities. What happened after that was no longer in my hands. What was in my hands had already been documented, organized, and spoken for itself. The Marchands retained French counsel within days of returning home. They left Jacksonville with none of what they came for. Not Lachelle's signature, not the business, not the quiet resolution Armand had believed he could negotiate in a conference room with a woman he had badly underestimated for 3 years. They left with active civil exposure following them across the ocean, and Isabeau's written statement permanently attached to the record surrounding the dispute. Lucien's existing marriage to Isabeau collapsed whatever credibility remained around the engagement. Any path toward a legitimate marriage to Lachelle had already been compromised long before she understood what was happening around her. The engagement ended quietly after that, not with screaming, not with spectacle. Just the slow legal and emotional unraveling of something that had never been what it claimed to be. The plan was over. Lachelle did not heal quickly. I did not expect her to. The damage of understanding you were selected rather than loved does not resolve on a legal timeline. It moves at its own pace through a person, and there is nothing anyone can do to accelerate it. I did not try. What I did was stay close without crowding, available without demanding. The way you sit near someone in the dark, not to fix anything, just so they are not alone in it. 3 weeks after the meeting, she came to the house on a Sunday afternoon. No particular reason given. She let herself in with her key the way she always had, and found me in the kitchen, and we made tea and moved without discussion to Darnell's study, the room we had both been circling around for different reasons for 3 years. We sat. The room held us the way it always had. His desk, his chair, the filing cabinet that had given us everything we needed when we finally looked closely enough. Lachelle's eyes moved to the desk, to the photograph sitting there. Darnell and Armand at that business dinner, laughing, completely unguarded. I had left it face up after the first major rulings came down. Some things deserved to be looked at directly, once it is safe to do so. She reached over and picked it up. She looked at it for a long time, long enough that I stopped watching and simply waited. Then she set it face down on the desk, the same way I had, in the same motion, without knowing she was completing something I had started. I watched it happen and said nothing for a long moment. Then I said, "Your father kept good records. He just didn't know he'd need them for this." Lachelle looked at the face-down photograph. Something in her exhaled, not a sound, just a release, and she nodded slowly. They came for what Darnell built. They forgot he left me here first.